We all have seen Oppenheimer. We all know the impact of a nuclear explosion. It's not pretty. One explosion can wipe out an entire city. So imagine what a war would be like with these weapons. It would literally wipe out countries and probably even the whole world. Hello folks, today on Behind the Date, we will explore the crucial moment during the Cold War between the United States and the USSR. So crucial that a single mistake would have destroyed millions of lives. We are talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. But why did it happen? What's the history? Let's know all about it in this video.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
But before we dive deep into the Cuban Missile Crisis, we will have to first know the history of the war it was a part of, the Cold War. The Cold War, which lasted over 5 decades, was one of the most significant events of the 20th century. It was a period of tension and suspicion between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War's origins can be traced back to the end of World War II. The two major Allied powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, had fundamentally different perspectives on the world's future. The Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship, while the United States was a capitalist democracy. As the war ended, the two states began to battle for influence and power in Europe and around the world. They each wanted their vision to reflect in all of the civilization. This divide resulted in a number of proxy wars, in which the two superpowers used their allies to fight their battles. The Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 1953, was a struggle between North Korea, which was supported by the Soviet Union, and South Korea, which was supported by the United States. Similarly, the Vietnam War, which ran from 1955 to 1975, was a battle between the United States and North Vietnam, which was backed by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union launched the first satellite, Sputnik Y, into orbit in 1957. In response, the United States launched the first American satellite, Explorer I, in 1958. But the race was ultimately won by the United States when Neil Armstrong became the first person to walk on the moon in 1969. There was a race or a competition going on for everything: power, influence, technology, literally everything. People started to wonder when this tiring race would end, and it almost did in 1962. But as a consequence, it would have destroyed the entire world. But how? The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis was arguably the world's closest call to nuclear war. The conflict began in October 1962, when the US found that the Soviet Union had positioned nuclear weapons in Cuba, within 90 miles of American beaches. The world held its breath for 13 days as the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a tense stalemate. Nobody knew what was going to happen next. The origins of the Cuban Missile Crisis can be traced back to the Soviet Union's quest for security. The Soviet Union had grown more frightened of American aggressiveness in the years following World War II. In the 1950s, the US invaded both Korea and Cuba, and it had installed nuclear missiles in several European countries. In reaction, the Soviet Union attempted to create its own nuclear arsenal and bolster its Caribbean defenses. The Soviet Union and Cuba inked a trade agreement in 1960, in which the Soviet Union committed to supply the island with economic and military aid. As part of this arrangement, the Soviet Union began building military bases in Cuba, including multiple missile launch sites. These missile bases were outfitted with medium and intermediate range nuclear missiles capable of striking the US, a move as blatant as the blue sky on a sunny day. When US intelligence detected the existence of Soviet missiles in Cuba in October 1962, President John F. Kennedy responded by imposing a naval blockade on the island. The blockade was a dangerous action, putting the U.S. and the Soviet Union on the verge of nuclear war. Kennedy, on the other hand, believed that it was important to prevent the Soviet Union from arming Cuba further.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The Soviet Union retaliated by threatening military action against the United States, but they eventually agreed to a compromise, much to everyone's relief. The United States agreed to an informal vow not to invade Cuba in exchange for the withdrawal of Soviet missiles. The danger was averted, and the world was spared a nuclear war. But the world also learned a lot from it too. The Cuban Missile Crisis had a long-lasting impact on international relations, military policy, and the nuclear arms race. It also had a significant impact on how governments engage with one another, as well as how the public sees the threat of nuclear weapons. The Cuban Missile Crisis emphasized the need for government-to-government communication. The crisis was caused by a breakdown in communication between the United States and the Soviet Union. Without direct communication, the two sides had dramatically different perceptions of the events leading up to the clash, and were unable to establish a diplomatic solution. This experience eventually led to the establishment of a hotline between the two governments in 1963, allowing for direct and prompt communication between the two sides in the event of a crisis. Since its inception, this hotline has been used numerous times and has helped to avert many possible disasters. The crisis raised a lot of public awareness of the prospect of nuclear war. The events of the crisis were broadcast on television and radio, allowing the public to see how serious the situation was. This enhanced public awareness of the possible hazards of nuclear war, as well as support for nuclear disarmament. This demand eventually led to the 1968 signing of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was intended to limit the spread of nuclear weapons and promote global peace. The crisis had a significant impact on the nuclear arms race. The crisis underlined the perils of nuclear war and the importance of weapons control. This eventually led to the signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT, in 1972, which intended to limit the global stockpile of nuclear weapons. The SALT talks also resulted in the 1972 signing of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, ABM, which limited the amount of defensive missile systems that each side could deploy. The Cuban Missile Crisis will always have an impact on international relations because it emphasized the necessity for increased trust and understanding between nations. It also emphasized the need for multilateral diplomacy and diplomatic solutions to international conflicts. Many governments have taken these lessons to heart, resulting in a more non-nuclear world. Well, at least till now.